Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy.
And I'm Brad.
And welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case, and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So this week is going to be a different type of true crime, and mainly for the most part, this episode is going to be a forgotten queer history episode with elements of true crime sprinkled in. I actually had a little poll on our Instagram and just asked you guys what type of case you wanted to see, and actually queer history won by quite a lot. And I got a lot of messages from people who were like, ooh, like I'd like to hear more about this and this part. And also people that were just like, I think it's really important, especially in today's political climate, to remember these pieces of queer history that aren't as talked about or have mainly been forgotten by mainstream media. And so wholeheartedly agree. And that's why today we're going to be talking about a piece of forgotten queer history that I first heard about, honestly, when we first started doing the podcast. But back then I was kind of like, it's a true crime podcast, so we're going to focus exclusively on murders and disappearances. And slowly, as we got into our groove, we were like, actually, this is a true crime and queer history podcast. Because I have learned a lot researching episodes for this podcast. Hopefully, you guys have learned a thing or two as well.
I have learned a lot researching episodes, and listening to your episodes, and hopefully you listening to mine.
Yeah, absolutely. We've learned so much from history of the gay panic defense to the hanky code to the events behind, like the real true events behind Stonewall, other tragedies that honestly I've never heard mentioned until I went really digging and searching and scouring the internet and library and news articles. We've even stumbled across serial killers that have never been covered before anywhere. So honestly, yeah, I love the queer history aspect of the podcast, and I know a lot of you guys do too. And yeah, it just helps us not only remember our past, but to keep it from happening in the future if it is bad.
Yeah, you got to remember your past to protect your future.
You do, especially now when they are actively trying to erase it, not naming any names, Google, but yeah,
Apple as well.
Apple, Amazon. But yeah, it's a pretty volatile time right now, especially in America. So we're going to give a little history lesson to remember that the struggle of queer people, and especially queer people of color, is not new, and we just got to keep on fighting the good fight. Also, just every episode we do cover on this podcast, even if it is mainly queer history, counts as a true crime case, and I'm sticking to my guns with that because for 99% of history and in most of the world even today, being queer is extremely illegal. So it's still a true crime episode.
There's a lot of countries still out there where it is illegal to be gay, and you can go back and listen to the episode we done on countries where it's still illegal to be gay.
You can. So I'll link that in the show notes. And all right, let's get back into it because we're going back a little ways in time. About 100 and so years, to be exact. This week, we're talking about a case that for nearly a century was buried and forgotten about and only saw the light of day after being discovered by pure accident. This case also takes us to one of the most prestigious and iconic universities in the world, Harvard. Although the college was and remains one of the most exclusive, well-respected, and renowned Ivy League colleges, period. I mean, I think everyone has heard of Harvard. And like, if you say the name Harvard, like, oh, he went to Harvard, it just carries so much weight, just that one word. Like, That's how prestigious it was, and it's been around since the 1600s, I think I read. So by the 1920s, when this case takes place, it was already hundreds of years old, already very well established. And a little known fact about it was that it had a dark underbelly that they attempted to bury. But as with most things, the truth always manages to find a way to the light. Over the span of 2 weeks back in the 1920s, the university conducted a large-scale witch hunt across their campus and even beyond as they sought out any and all, quote, deviant homosexuals. What started as a sad and tragic incident involving a student at the university soon caused a domino effect that would lead to the formation of a, quote, secret court held by all the top officials of the college, as the lives of over a dozen men would be forever affected. And even though 100 years have now passed, people are still fighting to this day to get their names cleared and to bring awareness to the unjust treatment they faced. Today we are going to be talking about Harvard's gay witch hunt, the secret court of 1920. So for 82 years, no one knew of this secret court outside of the people who oversaw it and those put on trial. During this time, the files and records of the court were stuffed away in the university's extensive catalog of information, over 500 years worth of information, and there it sat and collected dust until one fateful day in late November 2002. On this day, a sophomore at Harvard named Amit Pali was in the school's library going through their archives. Amit was a researcher for the school's undergraduate paper, the Harvard Crimson, and was looking for articles in order to write an upcoming story for the paper's next edition. But as he scoured the articles, one note in particular caught his attention and made him stop in his tracks. A file note marked only as, quote, Secret Court Files 1920. It came with a small blurb stating the files were in relation to a mysterious committee of Harvard officials who gathered to persecute Harvard students deemed to be engaged in homosexual activity back in 1920.
Persecute or prosecute?
Probably prosecute. I wrote persecute. Probably prosecute.
Just making sure, those are two very different words.
No, I would say persecute because they were punishing them, but also very hostile to them just for being gay. Like they didn't do anything wrong technically because 1920s, they didn't have any like official rules on the books for this. So they were just sought out for like, have you having ill thoughts with men? And if they thought you were, then they literally ruined these people's lives. It went beyond just expelling them or punishing them. They actively sought to make sure these men, their whole lives were over.
Okay, that would be persecution.
Okay, I was about to say, I think it's prosecute and persecute. They did both. Amit himself was drawn to this due to being a member of the community, and pretty soon he dropped the story he was originally researching and decided to dig further into this mysterious secret court, which started by requesting access to the actual court files from the university itself, which is a lot easier said than done. After several weeks of back and forth, the university eventually agreed to release the files, which included over 500 pages of documents, but on the condition that the names of those mentioned in the files be redacted, which led to a new search to uncover the identities of these individuals, especially the men persecuted and prosecuted for being homosexuals. Amit stated it was important to uncover these men's identities as they needed to be remembered and honored for what happened to them, stating that erasing them, quote, was an attack on their dignity, it's an attack on their memory and lives to not have the truth of who they were be told. Over the course of 6 months, Amit and other researchers at the paper poured over hundreds of pages of other available records from the college during this time, and eventually they were able to not only uncover the names of those involved, but also were able to piece together a lot about their lives. With this newly discovered information, the Harvard Crimson began releasing articles detailing the events of Harvard's secret court of 1920 starting in 2003, making this the first time that the event was ever reported on. So, let's travel back in time and go through everything that happened and discuss the lives of those affected. Sadly, This is not a happy story, and there's no part of it that is happy, but it all starts with a pretty heavy and tragic event, so slight trigger warning if self-harm affects you. The events of the secret court would be inadvertently kicked off by the tragic and sudden suicide of one of the school's students. So at just before 6 a.m. on May 13th, 1920, a woman named Mary Wilcox was awoken from her sleep by the smell of strong gas coming from down the hallway. Her and her family lived in Fall River, Massachusetts. She immediately knew the smell was coming from the bedroom of her youngest son, 20-year-old Cyril Wilcox. Since enrolling in Harvard a year and a half ago, Cyril had really begun to struggle in school and just in life in general. By the end of his first semester at Harvard, Cyril had been placed on academic probation for a month after he failed almost all of his classes and all of his finals. He was eventually suspended and was on the verge of being expelled completely, but after attending summer school, he was able to pull his grades up enough to convince administrators to allow him back. But even with this small success, Cyril was back to square one and was soon struggling once again. By the fall semester of his sophomore year, he was once again on the verge of failing all of his classes. His academic advisor would write to admins that Cyril was, quote, a bright young man, but that he never seemed to study and always seemed distracted by something. By the time he got his midterm grades in mid-March, all of which were failing, the assistant dean of Harvard, Edward Gay, informed Cyril that this would be his final chance, and if his grades hadn't improved by the end of April, the board would allow Cyril to withdraw from Harvard voluntarily, or they would have to be forced to expel him. Now, Cyril was under a lot of pressure on top of his schooling, as his older brother George Wilcox had excelled at school and had graduated from Harvard a few years earlier. So, on top of just, normal academic stress, he also had the stress of living up to his brother and his parents' expectation because, they expect something of me. They already have one kid. That's the golden child. I need to live up to that. So it's just stress upon stress upon stress. Now, as final exams approached in April, Cyril would never end up taking them, as just a few days prior to the exams, he went to the dean with a horrible case of hives, something the school physician stated was common in people suffering from extreme stress. Unable to take the exams, doctors advised Cyril to return home in order to recover, and he agreed. When it was clear that there was no catching up for him, school officials did allow him to withdraw from Harvard on April 15, 1920, due to, quote, ill health. After returning home, he still wasn't ready to give up just yet, and over the course of the next month, he wrote over a dozen letters to Edward Gay inquiring about any possibility for him to salvage his academics and return to school. Now, Edward was very forthright and made it clear that by that point, Cyril would not only be unable to return to Harvard, but he wouldn't even be able to receive credit for his sophomore year and would have to take the whole year over. So that's just another blow on top of it. You're already stressed, barely limping along through this year, and they're like, actually, you get to go back and do it if you even got accepted, which you probably won't.
And that's also got to make you feel like even more of a failure.
Yeah, and you feel like you're drowning because you're like, there's no catching up at this point. What am I supposed to do? Now, Mary knew the stress that her son was having, and it greatly affected him. So as she ran towards his room, as the smell of gas grew stronger, she feared the worst, and her fears were correct. Inside of his room, she found Cyril dead in bed. The gas line that connected to a bedroom light above his bed had been turned all the way on and left on, causing him to asphyxiate in his sleep. Which that also was very common back in the 1920s because they had lights in their room that were connected to just gas lines. And so a lot of people would just leave it turned on and go to sleep and just never wake up. Now, although his death was reported as an accident in the local paper the next day, Cyril's family and friends knew it was a suicide. While he didn't leave behind a suicide note, it seemed obvious that the pressure of academic stress was the leading cause of him taking his own life. But upon further investigation, it seems that that may not have been the only reason.
I have an idea what the reason was.
Do you? I wonder what the reason could be. The previous night, before he took his own life, Cyril had one last conversation with his older brother George and confided his deepest secret. As the two talked, Cyril confessed to his brother that he had been having a homosexual relationship with a local older man named Harry Dreyfus. What exactly was said or how George took the news is not known, as he had little time to process it before his brother would be dead. Now, while the family began to grieve and tried to pick up the pieces of their lives, like, very sad, like, he definitely, obviously, the academic stress was a huge leading part, but it also seems that the fact that he was a closeted homosexual was weighing heavy on his mind. This is the 1920s. Very, very sadly common thing back then. And up to that point, it just seemed like a sad and tragic, isolated incident. Like, it's sad, it's tragic, but it happened and slowly will begin to heal. But that's when the letters began to arrive. 2 days after Cyril's suicide, a letter arrived at his parents' home addressed to him and postmarked the day before his death. George opened the letter and read through it, which the letter was from another sophomore at Harvard named Ernest Roberts, and in the 9-page letter, Ernest revealed that not only was Cyril very much gay, but a part of a secret group of other gay students at Harvard who all knew each other, hung out in secret, and slept with one another and other students at the school.
What kind of person would send that to, like, the parents of a dead person?
Well, it wasn't. It was addressed to Cyril. It was postmarked the day before his death, which means they sent the letter before he killed himself.
So this was like a letter to Cyril, but why
Yeah.
would he be explaining something Cyril already knew about?
Well, they were talking about, like, their plans, and remember, Cyril had left school. And so Ernest was telling him, like, what they've been up to. What
So
the
Ernest
had
was
been.
also in this homosexual. Okay.
Yes.
That makes more sense. I thought this was sent and was like, oh, they're kind of the way you said it. It was like there's this secret society of homosexuals, and that's how he's explaining it.
Well, there is. And I mean, that is kind of how he explained it. Like, they're a secret group that gets together, like, they found each other, which is already very rare.
That just seems like a weird letter. Hey, you know the secret cult of homosexuals where we all sleep together?
And but also we have to remember, this is long before text messages. So that's how you communicate, like, this is an old friend, like, hey, like, this is what's going on with the parties that we have in
I
secret.
hope this letter finds you well. The orgy is at noonish, a fortnight away.
I'll actually let you read part of it.
Ken Day is being sucked by any and everyone we meet, anyone he can lay hands on. I suck it up for him once in a while just to distract myself. Since you left, I've tried to be chaste, not chased, CHASTE, not ED, just because you couldn't see that. The way it's spelled, chaste and chaste.
Is it chase and chast?
Chaste and chaste, that's what's funny. She's chaste, not chase. I haven't made it with Bradley yet, but when I do, it will last for 2 days and 2 nights, and it will be glorious.
So, I mean, as you can see, at least from my perspective, it is just like a friend being like, hey, I know you're going through it. Let me just catch you up on what the group is doing.
I mean, that makes sense. He's spilling the tea,
He is.
basically.
And I love the fact that even in 1920s, the gays are spilling the tea, just in letters.
It was just the way you described it at first. It sounded like, here is a letter about a secret cult of gays that are having sex with each other. That's like your pal sending you a letter and talking the tea.
Well, hold on to your bloomers, because here in a minute, a letter will be sent with the conspiracy that Harvard is overran with homosexuals. But we'll get to that here in a minute. So the letter went on to describe, quote, faggoty parties that Ernest would often host in his dorm room late at night, and often featured multiple young men fooling around, giving and receiving oral and anal sex with one another. The letter was also made mention of several other local Boston men who didn't attend Harvard, but were involved with the sex parties. Before George even had time to process this letter, a second letter would arrive addressed to Cyril, this time postmarked the day of his suicide. So again, before they knew he was dead, they sent the letter, and it was intercepted by his brother. This letter was from a man named Harold Saxton, a recent graduate from Harvard in the class of 1919. Harold talked about Ernest and his sex parties, as well as several parties coming up that would involve alcohol, which at this point was illegal as this was the first year of the Prohibition.
Gay and drinking.
So they're gay and they're drinkers, so double trouble. The letter also talked about the group visiting several secret gay clubs in the area and picking up men there to hook up with. So following the second letter, George decided to investigate himself and figure out what exactly was going on with his brother and at Harvard University. So of course, unfortunately, instead of just ignoring it, he was like, I'm actually going to get to the bottom of it. I think this caused my brother to kill himself. It's those homos, so I'm going to uncover this corrupt, immoral group of people.
But, if those letters were talking about these sex parties with women, it would just be like the frat boy lifestyle, and they'd be like, yeah, high five, brother.
Yeah, and that's the double standard there. So to start his investigation, George decided to pay a visit to the local man Cyril admitted he had been in a relationship with, Harry Dreyfus. So Harry was 8 years older than Cyril, having been born on January 1st, 1891. He worked as a waiter at Club Dreyfus, a bar within a hotel owned by his father in Boston. George tracked Harry down here and proceeded to drag him out into the street and violently beat him, accusing him of causing his brother's suicide. George began questioning Harry, who admitted the relationship, as well as giving George the names of 3 other men involved in the, quote, homosexual ring, which included Ernest Roberts, a Harvard dental student named Eugene Cummings, and a man named Pat Courtney, a local man who lived in the area but didn't attend Harvard. Using this information, on May 22nd, George went to Harvard and met with the dean at the time, Chester N. Greeno. He informed him of Cyril's suicide, as well as the, quote, secret network of homosexuals living on campus, giving him the names of the men he got from Harry, as well as the letter addressed to his brother as evidence. By the next day, Chester got into contact with Harvard president at the time, Lawrence Lowell, and presented the evidence and asked how to proceed. Lawrence stated that this case should not go through proper school administration, as it can often be slow-moving, and he wanted to avoid negative press coverage. Because again, remember, this is a ring, not just one, a ring of homosexuals secretly living among us. Could you imagine how bad that would look on Harvard if this news got out? And honestly, yeah, back then, this would have been a national headline story. So he's like, yeah, keep this on the down low, handle it privately, do not tell anyone.
And it would still be a national headline story today.
Oh, definitely. So Lawrence instructed Chester to work with several other high-ranking university officials and work to gather evidence on the subject in order to present it to him, and he'll figure out how to proceed. Chester agreed and brought in Dr. Robert Lee, the university's physician who provided the male students' physicals and who would be comfortable asking difficult sexual questions. The third member would be Matthew Luce, who oversaw disciplinary actions over the students. And the final 2 members brought in would be the assistant deans, Edward Gay and Kenneth Murdoch. All 5 collectively referred to themselves as the Secret Council, as their mission was to remain as discreet as possible in their investigation. Their mission would involve trying to gather enough proof of these accusations in order to report back to President Lawrence for him to decide what would be done with the students found engaging in such behavior. But that was honestly easier said than done at first, as the council found themselves in a dilemma. 2 of the men mentioned by name in the letters weren't even students at the school, and Harold Saxon had already graduated. That only left Ernest Roberts, who, although they were able to confirm the letter was written by him, they were not about to accuse him of anything without solid, concrete evidence of the homosexual acts.
His daddy was rich,
as Ernest was actually the son of State Representative Ernest Roberts Sr., one of the most prominent and powerful politicians in Washington, D.C. and Boston at the time. So the one person they do have kind of concrete proof on, they're like, we're not about to go
kick this hornet's nest.
Yeah, we're not about to go mess with this very powerful politician's son, accusing him. Honestly, that's worse than accusing him of murder. Accusing him of being a homosexual, you don't do that. So in order to get enough physical proof, The council brought in a business student named Windsor Hosmer, who was close friends with Ernest, and asked him to stake out Ernest's dorm room for several days and nights to report back all the people he saw coming and going from the room.
I was fixing to say, this sounds like the setup for like a gay 21 Jump Street.
It is, yeah, and that's what they're kind of doing. Like, we can't just go around accusing people because then word's going to get out. We have to be very discreet
We got to plant people inside and have them stake things out.
to take down this corrupt homosexual ring of students. Which also, reading some of the parties, they did be doing some wild stuff in those dorm rooms. So I'm like, okay. I mean, live your life, but also you are playing with fire. Some of the crazy stuff they were doing.
Well, you got to think, probably if they're going to Harvard, they're used to getting whatever they want.
They are, and also Ernest was not an idiot. He knew his dad, and so he was like, I can pretty much do what I want because they're not going to kick me out because my dad gives a lot of money to the school. So I think it's also part of that. Like, I can get away with it, and what are they going to do? So by the end of the third day, Windsor reported back to the council that he witnessed several men coming and going from the apartment late at night, including several other Harvard students named Keith Smerag, Eugene Cummings, Nathaniel Wolfe, and Kenneth Day. Now, Kenneth's name really stuck out to the council. As it turns out, he was actually Cyril's roommate when he was at Harvard. As they finally had other students to interrogate outside of Ernest, a new twist was added when an anonymous letter would arrive addressed to the council.
The secret council gets a secret letter?
Yes. So this is literally like a 21 Jump Street mystery. The secret council, 3 days into their investigation,
They're not very good at hiding their secret council.
got to the office one day and there was just a letter, unmarked, laying on their desk, and it was about to spill some serious tea. So by this point, the council had been asking around campus a little bit, and rumors, you know how rumors are, they began to spread around about their intentions. On May 26th, an unsigned letter was found on the desk of Dean Chester. The letter was only signed as being from the, quote, class of 1921.
The whole class.
In it, the unnamed author went into great detail about Cyril's suicide and how it was directly caused by his involvement with a group of, quote, deviant homosexuals on campus. The author even explained how Cyril got involved with the group in the first place, writing, and I'll let you read this, Brad.
While in his freshman year in college, he met some boys, mainly in his own class, who committed upon him and induced him to indulge in these unnatural acts. He realized he did not have enough character to refuse them or break away from them, and it seemed suicide was the only way out for him. The leader of the students responsible for these deplorable acts, and the one directly responsible for Cyril's suicide, is Ernest Roberts from Perkins Building in room 2C. Roberts' room was where he and those like him gathered during the past year and conducted these, quote, parties. How these parties got past the proctors is unknown to me. These parties consisted of sailors and men Roberts and the other students picked up from the streets of Boston and used them for their dirty, immoral purposes. At these parties were notorious young degenerates including Harold Hussey and Ned Courtney, and many others of the same type. Many of them also dressed as women in women's clothing. The most disgusting and disgraceful of these acts and revolting acts of degeneracy and depravity took place in this room in full view of all who were present. Isn't it time to put an end to this type of thing in college? Well, if it took place and you're writing about it to everyone present, I would assume that you were there.
Right, like
including Harold Hussey and Ned Courtney.
yes, Harold Hussey and
Notorious.
Ned Courtney were at these parties, and apparently so was this anonymous letter writer because, like, how do you know all this? Because I know someone wasn't coming up to you flapping their gums about it.
No,
So-
you don't. That's not like something you just run around and talk about at school in
To the
the
point-
1920s.
To the point where you know what they're doing and doing it and who they're doing it in front of, and the fact that they're going out and finding random men and sailors specifically to bring back to these parties. You look just as guilty, Miss Thing.
Oh, they were definitely there.
They were, and most likely, of course, this is someone who is filled with a lot of self-hatred. And, it's one of those things where, well, if I throw the sin off me, then they're not going to think that I was involved with these depraved acts of sex. The letter also names several other students, which also freaking snitch.
No joke. Snitches get stitches, buddy.
I'm like, one, it's none of your damn business anyway. How does this affect you in any way? The letter also names several other students, including Eugene Cummings, Kenneth Day, and a man named Edward Say. Following this letter, the council decided that this was enough evidence to proceed forward with the mock trial, and they decided to act.
This was enough evidence. This anonymous letter from an anonymous person to a secret council that was just left on their desk.
And to them it was.
That's what happens when you step outside the normal judicial realm of how things are handled and do it vigilante style.
And they knew most likely if this had went through the proper channels, this wouldn't have happened, because later on, it's not public news, but the families of these students would find out what happened. And all of them were like, this does not seem legally right. Because it wasn't. The council began on Thursday, May 20th, 1920, as they sent out summons and letters to over a dozen witnesses. Students summoned to the council were told to cut final exams short and to show up for the meeting by any means necessary. The first person called to testify in front of the council was Kenneth Day, as his name had been mentioned the most frequently apart from Ernest's. The council confronted Kenneth with all their evidence, and although at first he tried to deny it, he eventually caved in and admitted that he had engaged in homosexual acts, mainly with Ernest and Cyril Wilcox, and several other men at the parties thrown in Ernest's room. Pretty soon Kenneth was answering all the council's questions, including when they started throwing names of other students at him and having him state whether they were guilty or not guilty of homosexual acts. Other students brought in were questioned about their masturbation habits, their friends, their families, their sexual experiences, not with just men, but also women, their familiarity with homosexuality, and just many other extremely personal questions. They also questioned them about other establishments that were known gathering spots for homosexuals. They found that among multiple other locations around Boston, Cafe Dreyfus was a very popular hangout spot for queer people. Many of the students interrogated during the court tried to deny the allegations at first, but after being confronted with the circumstantial evidence gathered by the court, most caved, with many admitting that they had in fact engaged in at least some homosexual acts, while others admitted that they only mutually masturbated with other men, and some admitting that they had engaged in gay sex, but had since been cured and no longer partook in it. One student interviewed even stated that he only did it because he felt, quote, a man should know everything, including what it feels like to sleep with a man. That does not make him homosexual. That makes him a scientist.
Hallelujah, brother. You don't know what you like until you try it.
You don't. And honestly, props to him, because he was like, you got to do what you got to do to, get out of trouble. I mean, they're not going to believe me if I say I didn't do it. So I might as well tell them I did it and then be like, I am a scientist and I did it for scientific purposes. That doesn't make me a homosexual. And fun fact, it worked. So after 2 days of testimony from students and even 2 professors at the school who were also found to be involved with the parties, the court finally decided that it was time to bring in the ringleader, Ernest Roberts, for questioning. Ernest was like Cyril in a lot of ways, in the fact that he was described as a bright man, but never seemed to study and was always receiving very poor grades in school. But unlike Cyril, Ernest had the connections to avoid threats of expulsion, and he hoped to enroll in Harvard Medical School after graduation. Now again, at first Ernest denied the allegations, but again, after being confronted with the other's testimony, he eventually confessed to sexual relationships with over a dozen men, including Cyril. He also stated that it was actually Cyril who started the homosexual parties and that he himself had been led astray by Cyril Wilcox.
It's always good to blame the dead person. that doesn't have to defend themselves
Yeah,
or anything like that.
they're not around to defend themselves. So it's like, might as well put the blame on him. So get me out of it. And it is always fascinating, like, especially around this time. This is kind of a side note, but like how these large groups of queer men, especially gay men, found each other. Like we're talking over 50 people involved, like Harvard students and other local men involved with this kind of pretty tight knit group of people that partied, hung out together, had sex together. And it just shows you that, life finds a way, and it doesn't matter how taboo or how much you try to ban it or outlaw it, people will find each other. So Ernest further elaborated about Cyril and Harry Dreyfus' relationship, stating the two men met in the summer at a gay club called the Lighted Lamp, and that Cyril secretly lived with Harry part-time, but that he eventually broke up with Harry not long before his suicide, and that Harry began threatening to expose the relationship to Harvard. Ernest believes this was probably what caused Cyril to actually kill himself. Ernest's testimony to the council was full of contradictions, with him often switching his story multiple times, making it unclear the full extent of everything he was involved with, which probably intentional.
Or he's just a bad liar.
Or he's just a bad liar. Again, probably that arrogance of, I didn't think people would actually try to get me in trouble because, you know who my daddy is. Now, during this time, one student on the council's radar did seem to have caught on of what was happening, and he was beginning to panic, and he started trying to do damage control. On May 29th, George Wilcox reached back out to Harvard and stated that he had been approached by dental student Eugene Cummings, who attempted to tell him that Cyril was in league with Ernest in attempting to corrupt the male students at Harvard, including himself. This meeting ended with George beating Eugene up like he did with Harry. Following this, it was Eugene's turn to face the council and explain his side of the story. Now, Eugene seemed more frantic than most of the other men, and although he admitted to being at several of Ernest's room parties, he never took part in anything, despite the others attempting to persuade him to join. And again, it's a he said, she said situation, but if you admit to being at gay parties, sadly, there's no denying it.
I would like to know what Cyril's brother, like his stance on things, because he did go and throw fists around town in his brother's name.
Honestly, obviously, I'm not a psychologist. I can't speak for him. I do think it's one of those things where it's like coping. Honestly, it's usually like, my brother was a good boy and he was led astray and seduced by these evil, corrupt homosexuals. Like, it's not his fault. It's all these other degenerate students who are enticing him and brainwashing him, and that's what led him to kill himself. So I do think it's, you're putting the blame on somebody else to take your anger out on, because, the loss of a loved one, especially when it's so sudden or they do take their own life, it doesn't make any sense. It seems scary. You're angry. You don't know who to be angry at. But this was the perfect situation to be angry at, especially for George. And the two had to have been close. If Cyril actually confessed fully, like, hey, I'm gay and I've been dating a man to his brother. So I think that is an indication that the family was very close to one another.
At least the brothers.
At least the brothers. And so honestly, part of it's really sad to me. It's a tragic case all around. I know we've been joking here and there through it, but during this, I can't imagine you're at Harvard, whole life ahead of you. You're like, family's so proud, your friends are so proud, and then the fact that you like to sleep, who you like to sleep with behind closed doors, you're not hurting anyone, that can ruin everything for you. And so that is like, really have to understand the desperation for these men, especially like Eugene Cummings. Again, I can feel like that pit in your stomach where you're like, they're on to me being gay. Like, that's worse than if they found out I murdered somebody. And so you're like, I don't know what to do. The world's closing in around me. And so you really do feel for these men. So in less than 2 weeks, the secret council had discovered and interrogated 50 students and other local men who were accused of being involved in the homosexual ring at Harvard. The court concluded on June 2nd, and by the end of it, 13 men were found to be the most guilty and received various forms of punishment based off how much the council felt they were involved with homosexual activity. And also, this list includes people that didn't even go to Harvard. And so they're like sending out summons to these random men around Boston. Like, hey, you need to report to Harvard University. And a few of them actually did. They're like, okay, 2 employees of the Cafe Dreyfus with no connection to Harvard were actually called to be summoned by the secret court and accepted to be interviewed. Ned Courtney and Harry Dreyfus agreed to an interview, but at the end of it, nothing could be done because they didn't go there, and so they were just let go without any further action.
But their names are still part of this.
But their names are still part of it. Harry Dreyfus would go on to move to Miami. He never married and passed away in 1978. 8 other students that were currently enrolled at Harvard were all expelled and told to leave Cambridge immediately. This included Kenneth Day, Stanley Gilkey, Joseph Lombard, Eugene Cummings, Edward Say, Keith Smirage, Nathaniel Wolfe, and Ernest Roberts. 4 of the students, Kenneth Day, Stanley Gilkey, Joseph Lombard, and Nathaniel Wolfe, were told that they could actually reapply to Harvard within a year or two, because those are the ones that they were, according to court records, they were too involved with the ring for the court's liking. Like, there was no mention of their names being actually doing anything gay, and there was no proof, and they never admitted to it. But the court was just like, y'all are just too friendly with a lot of people that were involved, so we're going to expel you too. But as a peace offering, you can apply in a year or two. Now, same can't be said for the other 4, with all of them being told they were banned from campus and to never set foot in Cambridge ever again. On top of this, the council made it known that their school files would include a note that listed the reason they were expelled and that no one at Harvard would provide them with a letter of recommendation to any other college. So this is where the persecute comes in. It's not just like expel, just leave. This was like, we're altering your school records and transcripts to include the reason you were expelled. And so now anytime you try to go to apply to a different college and they ask to see your transcripts, they're going to know you're expelled for being a part of a deviant homosexual ring. And to top it all off, Harvard would be sending letters to all the families of the expelled students, informing them of their son's involvement with homosexual activity. Again, it wasn't even you just leave, just get out of here. It was, we're going to make sure you never get accepted into another college. And on top of that, we're going to let your whole family know that you're gay. Now, surprisingly, by all accounts, that could be found, the parents of every one of the students were either completely accepting of their sons or forgave them. All the parents wrote strong letters to the dean of Harvard, Chester Greenough, stating that the punishment for the boys was far too strict and unfair and that they all should be allowed to return. So for 1920s, that's a good thing. Like, I'm not sure. Like, I'm sure all of them didn't just like, I love my gay son, but I'm sure most of them were like, I mean, okay, yeah, but
a horrible injustice will bring people together too.
Oh yeah.
If they're like, hey, look at this dog and pony show that you had to go through and all this that my son had to go through, and then you kicked him out of school for being gay, I'm more pissed at you than him.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, yeah, punish them, but look, what you're doing is beyond even your scope as a school administrator.
Yeah, this is not anything in the scope. Like, where is this in any kind of book, how this should be handled? Again, it's handled by a secret court, a secret council, so that they can do a vigilante and deal out like vigilante justice, right?
And that's exactly what they did. So it is these letters that prompted the council to allow some of the students the ability to reapply to Harvard after a year or two. And following the secret court, the contents of which were stricken from all public Harvard records and no media coverage was allowed of the incident, the only mention of the secret court would occur about a week after it was held, following the suicide of another student. On July 11th, Eugene Cummings was taken to the infirmary after complaining of feeling ill. After being left alone briefly, he used his knowledge of medicine to intentionally overdose on pills. Following this, the local paper reported that Eugene was actually an acquaintance of Cyril and that he had been interrogated over a, quote, unknown incident related to Cyril's suicide. And of course, this directly caused him to commit suicide. After this, the secret council was disbanded and life was to continue on as normal at Harvard, with no indication to the public that anything was even wrong in the first place. The fate of the students punished varied. Kenneth Day attempted to reapply to Harvard but was denied. He went on to move to New York, where he married a woman and had 2 children while working as a head bank teller. Stanley Gilkey was readmitted to the college in 1923 due to, quote, no actual evidence of homosexual activity. He eventually graduated and went on to be a show producer on Broadway for over 20 years. Joseph Lombard was also readmitted and eventually went on to be a very well-respected and decorated lawyer within the government. Keith Smarague moved to Greenwich Village, where he worked as an actor before committing suicide in 1930. Now, the supposed ringleader of the homosexuals, Ernest Roberts, would also try to reapply to Harvard and was denied. He married less than a year after his expulsion, had a son named Ernest Jr., and he went on to start his own very successful interior design business. Dean Chester Greenaw also received another anonymous letter from the same letter writer as the first one, this time chastising him for giving up already and stating that there were more than 100 homosexuals still on campus that needed to be taken care of. And thankfully, this time the letter received no response from Chester, as he stated, quote, the court has already exhausted every avenue they could, and the case was closed. And that was it. The secret court remained buried and forgotten for 82 years until it was rediscovered in 2002. And following that discovery by Amit Pali, he did all he could to thrust the story into the spotlight with his articles addressing the incident, calling upon modern-day officials at Harvard to address the injustice faced by the students all those decades ago. The Harvard president at the time in 2002, Lawrence Summers, would actually issue an official statement stating, quote, these reports of events long ago are extremely disturbing. They are part of a past that we have rightfully left behind. I want to express our deep regret for the way this situation was handled, as well as the anguish the students and their families must have experienced 8 decades ago. Whatever attitudes may have been prevalent then, persecuting individuals on the basis of sexual orientation is abominable and an affront to the values of our university. We are a better and more just community today because those attitudes have changed as much as they have. Now, despite this statement, Amit and many others felt that this wasn't enough and began a petition for the school to grant posthumous degrees to the students expelled because of the secret court. The university attempted to push back at first, stating that they didn't grant degrees to students unless they completed all necessary coursework before their deaths. But this was countered when it was discovered that at least 28 students were awarded degrees before they completed their work during World War I. Starting in 2010, an event known as Third Day in the Yard was formed by students, and they advocated for the secret court students to be granted their degrees, leading to a Facebook page and website being formed. Even 100 years later, now that those affected by the secret court of 1920 are public knowledge, people continue to fight for justice to be served. In 2019, a website called Secret Court 100 was launched by students and again called for the students to be given posthumous degrees and for further improvements to be made for the current generation of queer students at Harvard. Amit is now the CEO of the Trevor Project, one of the largest nonprofits that provides suicide prevention for queer people, and still works to this day to make sure that those affected by the witch hunt carried out on Harvard's campus are not forgotten or buried away ever again. And that is the story of Harvard's secret court of 1920, aka their gay witch hunt.
With vigilante justice.
And again, like I said, we kind of joked a lot throughout the episode, but at the same time, this was a horrible situation. It was very unfair, unjust, and it just really show you the times back then where it's like, what are they supposed to do? Like, you know, being gay was one of the worst things you could be, and it's like, I can't tell anybody because then that's just more people that know. How am I going to defend myself against homosexual allegations? And it's just one of those things. It was so senseless. It was so tragic. So many young men, they're in Harvard, so they have very bright futures, just got cut short or ripped from them. Their lives were ruined because they were outed to their families just because they enjoyed having some sex on their downtime with other men.
And, you know, my joking in this episode was nothing against the young men involved in it. It was really the situation was so asinine. These people were not doing anything to anybody else. They were having their gay parties. They got blamed for somebody's suicide when also the whole time being in Harvard is the most stressful thing you could probably ever be in your life.
Oh, yeah.
And then being a gay student in the 1920s in Harvard got to compound that. And then also when you're in a relationship, a secret relationship with a man at that time, and things are going bad and you're a young person, you know how that can just spiral you into, oblivion. Definitely was not poking fun at the students involved. It was these people that done this asinine vigilante justice secret court.
But also, the situation itself was ridiculous. Like, all these well-respected doctors and Harvard officials, the dean, got together and formed a secret council to weed out homosexual activity. They got other students involved to stake out people's dorm rooms. They officially summoned grown men who've never even been to Harvard to step before this secret court and answer for your actions. It's just so ridiculous. And again, it is very reflective of the times and homosexual activity wasn't as well known and, of course, very looked down on. And so, yeah, excuses like, I slept with a man, but that's because I'm a scientist, and I think a man should know how everything feels. And back then, they're like, hey, yeah, that makes sense. All right, yeah, that's fine. And so it's just one of those ridiculous things. And I'd love to say that we've come a long way in 105 years. Yeah, 105 years. And we've made a lot of good strides, of course, but there are still some people out there that think like that. And it's very scary to think in 2025 there are people that are like, you can be gay from drinking after a homosexual. And so it's just so ridiculous. And I think that's why it's important to remember stories like this, again, because Harvard tried to bury it, and it was only by pure fate.
I think Harvard tried to bury it because what they done and the justice they doled out was not legal.
It wasn't legal. But again, it's like, what are you going to do? Like, you're gay. Like, either you take our punishment or we're going to ruin your life even more. And so it's one of those horrible things where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And yeah, they don't want people to know that they persecuted all these young men for, off the record, did not follow school protocol at all. And this was sanctioned by the president of Harvard. And so it was all just very shady, very unethical. And yeah, I can definitely see why one of the most prestigious schools in the world would want to bury it. But it does really make me feel at least a little better that even in 2025, people are still fighting and advocating for these students back in 1920 who are long dead, but just because they're dead doesn't mean like their memory should still be tarnished. Like, they should get justice even if it is after death. And so I love the fact that queer people are resilient as they are. There's no getting rid of them. You can't scare them. You can't beat them into submission because they're just going to get right back up. And I think that's a very special message to put out there and to end the episode on, especially in the times we are in right now. And so, yeah, just remember that. It's a little scary right now, but we will survive. And with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in for another episode. If you enjoyed today's episode and the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast, and of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until next week, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.